Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. My grandma gave me Ouija board as a present. Something is wrong in my basement. I never thought I'd be the type of person to post something like this. Honestly, I'm still debating if I'm just overthinking things, or if there's really something going on. But I guess I'll start from the beginning, and you guys can tell me if I'm crazy or not. So, a little bit about me first. I'm 26, living in a small town in upstate New York. Nothing ever really happens around here. It's quiet, maybe too quiet sometimes. I work from home as a freelance graphic designer, so I spend a lot of time alone in my house. It's a modest place, nothing special, just a small 2-bedroom with a basement that I use for storage. That basement will be important later, but I'll get to that. A couple of months ago, my grandma passed away. She was one of those old school types, always had weird trinkets and stuff around her house. My family used to joke that she was a hoarder, but she always insisted everything had a purpose. Anyway, after she passed, my mum and I were going through her stuff, and we found this old Ouija board tucked away in a dusty closet. The thing looked ancient, like one of those old handcrafted ones, with a wooden planchette and faded letters. I'm not really into that kind of stuff. I've never believed in ghosts or spirits, and to be honest, the whole idea of a Ouija board just seemed like a cheesy Halloween gimmick. But when I showed it to my mum, she told me that my grandma used to swear by it. She said that grandma would sometimes sit for hours talking to spirits, and that she believed the board had some kind of connection to the other side. I shrugged it off as just another one of grandma's quirky habits. Here's where things start to get weird. My mum decided I should keep the Ouija board. She said it was kind of a family heirloom and that grandma would have wanted me to have it. I didn't argue. I mean, what was I going to do? Tell her no? So I took it home and put it on a shelf in my living room. It was more of a decoration than anything else. A conversation piece if anyone ever visited. Which, by the way, no one ever did. Like I said, I'm a bit of a loner. For the first couple of weeks, nothing happened. The board just sat there, gathering more dust, just like it probably had at Grandma's house. But then, one night, I started hearing noises from the basement. Now, I know what you're thinking. Basements are always creepy. But this wasn't just the usual creaks and groans that old houses make. It was more like shuffling, like something was moving down there. I figured it was just the house settling, or maybe a raccoon that had gotten inside. I tried to ignore it, but every night the noises would get a little louder, a little closer, almost like they were right beneath me. One night, I finally decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight, went down the creaky stairs, and looked around. Nothing. The basement was just as I'd left it. Boxes piled up, old furniture covered in sheets, and a thick layer of dust on everything. I even looked behind the boxes, thinking maybe an animal had gotten trapped, but there was nothing there. The air felt colder than usual though, and I remember feeling a weird sense of unease, like I was being watched. I laughed it off, telling myself I'd been watching too many horror movies and headed back upstairs. But the noises didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. And then, one night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a voice, a whisper, faint and muffled, but definitely a voice. It was coming from the basement. At first, I thought I was hearing things. Maybe the TV was on, or maybe it was just my imagination. But then, it happened again. Clearer this time. It was definitely coming from the basement, and it sounded like it was calling my name. I froze. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural, but in that moment, I felt something I'd never felt before. Pure, unadulterated fear. I wanted to run out of the house, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the basement door, which was now slightly ajar. The voice called my name again, and this time, it sounded like my grandma. I don't think I've ever moved as fast as I did that night. The second I heard that voice, My grandma's voice, I swear. I slammed the basement door shut and bolted up the stairs to my bedroom. I locked the door behind me and just stood there, trying to convince myself that I hadn't heard what I knew I'd heard. I'm not the kind of person who gets scared easily, but this was different. This wasn't just fear. It was like a chill that had settled into my bones, making me feel cold from the inside out. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, like I'd crossed some invisible line without even knowing it. The worst part was, I couldn't stop thinking about that Ouija board. It was like a splinter in my mind, just sitting there, waiting for me. I knew I was being irrational. There was no way an old piece of wood could be responsible for what was happening. But I couldn't help but wonder, what if Grandma had been right? What if the board really did have some kind of connection to the other side? I didn't sleep that night. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The house was dead silent, but I kept imagining I could hear that voice, whispering my name over and over again. By morning, I was exhausted, but I was also determined to get to the bottom of this. I spent most of the day avoiding the basement. I didn't even go downstairs to make coffee, which, for me, is saying something. Instead, I sat in the living room, staring at the Ouija board, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to just throw it out, get rid of it, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But another part of me, the part that was raised by my grandma, felt like I owed it to her to figure out what was going on. In the end, curiosity won out. I decided to do some research, hoping to find some logical explanation for what was happening. I spent hours online, reading about Ouija boards, the history behind them, the stories people had shared about their experiences. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Urban legends and ghost stories. Nothing that really explained what I was experiencing. But then, I stumbled across something that caught my attention. It was a forum, buried deep in the recesses of the internet, where people were sharing their own experiences with Ouija boards. Most of the posts were typical. People claiming they'd contacted spirits, had objects move on their own, stuff like that. But there was one post that stood out. The post was from a guy who said he'd inherited an old Ouija board from his grandmother, just like I had. He claimed that after he brought it home, he started hearing noises in his house too. At first, it was just the usual creaks and groans, but then it escalated to voices. Voices that sounded like his grandmother, calling his name. He said he tried to ignore it, but it only got worse. And then he mentioned something that made my stomach drop, the basement. According to his post, the noises always seemed to come from the basement. He said he felt like something was down there. Something that wasn't his grandmother, but was using her voice to lure him in. He warned that if the noises started getting louder, it was a sign that whatever it was getting stronger. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was like this guy was describing exactly what I was going through. I wanted to reach out to him, ask him what happened next, but the post was years old. The forum itself looked like it hadn't been active in a long time. It was like this guy had vanished off the face of the earth. That's when I started to panic. I didn't know what to do. I kept thinking about that voice, calling my name from the basement. Was it really my grandma? Or was it something else, something pretending to be her? And if it was something else, what did it want from me? I decided I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I packed a bag, grabbed my car keys, and drove to my parents' place across town. I didn't tell them what was going on. I knew they'd just think I was losing it. Instead, I made up some excuse about needing to get out of the house for a while, and they didn't question it. They were used to me being a bit of a recluse, so they were just happy I was around for a change. I stayed with them for a few days, trying to put some distance between myself and whatever was happening in my house. But the whole time, I couldn't stop thinking about the Ouija board. I knew I had to go back eventually, and the thought of it filled me with dread. On the third night at my parents' place, I had a dream. In the dream, I was standing at the top of the basement stairs, the door wide open in front of me. I could hear the voice calling my name, but this time it was louder, more insistent. The air around me was thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel something pulling me down the stairs, even though I couldn't see anything. When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I knew I couldn't run from this anymore. Whatever was in that basement, I had to face it. So, the next morning, I went back home. The house felt different, almost like it was holding its breath, waiting for me. The Ouija board was still sitting on the shelf, looking as innocent as ever. But I knew better now. That night, I made a decision. I was going to go down to the basement and see what was really going on. I wasn't sure what I was going to find down there, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to be the only one facing it. It took everything in me to work up the courage to go back to my house. The drive over felt like it took forever, my mind racing with every possible scenario. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. But I knew I couldn't avoid this any longer. Whatever was in the basement had been waiting for me, and I needed to confront it. When I walked through the front door, the house felt different, heavier somehow, like the air was thicker. I stood there for a minute, just listening. The silence was unsettling, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I could feel the weight of the Ouija board behind me, like it was silently watching me from its place on the shelf. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed my flashlight, the one I'd used the last time I went down to the basement, and walked over to the basement door. My hand hesitated on the doorknob, that familiar chill running down my spine. I took a deep breath and told myself that I wasn't going to let fear control me. Not this time. I opened the door, and the familiar creak of the hinges made my stomach lurch. The darkness at the bottom of the stairs seemed to swallow the light from the hallway. I flicked on the flashlight and pointed it down the steps. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I stepped onto the first stair, and the old wood groaned under my weight. Each step down felt like it was taking an eternity. The darkness pressing in on me from all sides. The flashlight beam bobbed with each movement, casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. I forced myself to keep going, even though every instinct was screaming at me to turn back, to run. When I finally reached the bottom, I stopped and listened. The basement was deathly quiet, but the oppressive feeling hadn't gone away. If anything, it had intensified. I swept the flashlight around, the beam catching the edges of old boxes, covered furniture, and the concrete floor. Everything looked just as it always had, but it felt wrong. Like the space had been twisted in some subtle, imperceptible way. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Movement. My heart jumped into my throat, and I whipped the flashlight toward the source. At first, I couldn't see anything, just the same old clutter that had been down there for years. But then, I saw it again. Something small and dark darting behind one of the boxes. I swallowed hard and took a step closer, the flashlight trembling in my hand. As I approached the box, the sense of dread intensified, like the very air was resisting my presence. I reached out with my free hand, preparing to move the box aside, but before I could touch it, something happened that nearly made me drop the flashlight. The voice, my grandma's voice, came again, louder this time, but not from the direction I'd expected. It was right behind me, so close that I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. It whispered my name in that same familiar yet distorted tone. I spun around, the flashlight beam whipping through the darkness, but there was nothing there. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep thinking clearly. "Grandma!" I called out, my voice shaky. It felt ridiculous, talking to an empty basement, but I didn't know what else to do. "If that's you, please, just show yourself." The words hung in the air, unanswered, the silence pressing in on me like a physical weight. I waited, the flashlight beam trembling as I slowly turned in a circle, scanning the room for any sign of movement. And then, I saw it. The Ouija board was on the floor in the middle of the basement, directly beneath where it had been sitting on the shelf upstairs. I hadn't touched it, hadn't even brought it down here, but there it was, the planchette resting dead center on the board, as if it had been waiting for me. My mouth went dry. I hadn't brought the board down. I hadn't touched it since I'd first put it on the shelf, but now it was down here, in the basement, in the dark. I approached it slowly, my footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent room. The closer I got, the colder the air seemed to become, until I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. I knelt down next to the board, the flashlight illuminating the faded letters and symbols. The planchette suddenly moved, just a fraction of an inch, but enough to send my heart racing again. I recoiled, nearly dropping the flashlight as I scrambled backward, but then it stopped, as if whatever had moved it was waiting for me to make the next move. I didn't want to touch it. Every fibre of my being was screaming at me to get out of there, to leave the board and never look back. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe it was that lingering feeling of obligation to my grandma. Whatever it was, it made me reach out, my hand trembling, and place my fingers lightly on the planchette. The air around me seemed to hum with energy as soon as I touched it, and I felt an almost magnetic pull beneath my fingers. The planchette began to move, slowly, deliberately, sliding across the board in a way that I knew I wasn't controlling. It moved to a single letter, G. My breath caught in my throat as it slid to the next letter, E, then T. Out, I whispered to myself, finishing the message in my head. Get out! But the planchette didn't stop. It kept moving, spelling out another word, and then another. When it finally stopped, I pulled my hand away as if I'd been burned, staring down at the words it had spelled out. Get out now! I didn't need any more convincing. I shot up, grabbing the flashlight, and bolted up the stairs, not caring about the noise I was making. The door to the basement was still open, and I didn't bother closing it as I ran through the house and out the front door. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't stop running until I was in my car. The door locked, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I sat there for a long time, staring at the house. The windows were dark, the front porch light casting long shadows across the lawn. It looked like any other house, quiet, peaceful, normal, but I knew better now. There was something in that house, something in the basement, and whatever it wasn't my grandma. I stayed in the car for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My fingers were still trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, staring at the dark silhouette of my house. I kept expecting to see something, anything, move in one of the windows, but the house remained eerily still, like it was pretending to be normal. I knew I couldn't stay out there all night though. I had to do something, figure out what was happening and how to stop it. Running away would only delay the inevitable. Whatever was in that basement had made it clear that it didn't want me there. But why? And more importantly, what was it? I thought about calling someone, maybe my parents, or even a friend, but I hesitated. How could I explain this without sounding completely insane? I didn't even fully understand it myself. The only thing I knew for sure was that the Ouija board was somehow at the center of all this. But why had it come to me? What connection did it have to my grandma? And why was it warning me to leave? My grandma had always been a bit mysterious, a woman of few words who seemed to know things she shouldn't. I'd never questioned it much when I was younger, chalking it up to her just being wise, having lived through so much. But now I was starting to wonder if there was more to it than that. Maybe she'd known something about the board that she hadn't told anyone, something dangerous. There was only one place I could think of to look for answers, back at my grandma's house. My mum had mentioned once that grandma kept journals, scribbling down thoughts, notes, recipes, anything that came to mind. If those journals still existed, they might have some clue about what I was dealing with. I made the decision to go there, even though it was well past midnight by now. The roads were empty as I drove through the sleepy town. The only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The familiar route to Grandma's house was lined with tall, shadowy trees that seemed to close in on me as I drove, like they were watching, waiting. When I finally pulled up to the old house, the sight of it sent a fresh wave of unease through me. It looked the same as it always had, quaint, with a small garden out front and a porch swing swaying slightly in the wind. But tonight it felt different. The shadows seemed darker, the air heavier, as if the house itself was aware of what I was about to do. I stepped out of the car and approached the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I still had a key from when I used to help Grandma with errands, and the lock clicked open easily. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the familiar scent of old wood and lavender filling my nostrils. I half expected to see my grandma sitting in her usual chair, knitting or reading, but of course, the house was empty. I flicked on the lights, which buzzed faintly as they illuminated the small living room. Everything was exactly as it had been the last time I'd been here. My mum hadn't gotten around to sorting through all of Grandma's things yet. I felt a pang of guilt, but I pushed it aside. I needed to focus. I made my way to the small study at the back of the house, where Grandma kept her desk and all her personal things. The door to the study was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I felt that same cold chill from the basement, like something was brushing past me, just out of sight. The study was cluttered, but organised, just like Grandma had always kept it. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with everything from old novels to dusty encyclopedias. The desk was covered in papers, some of them yellowed with age, and there were small trinkets scattered across the surface, things that probably had some special meaning to Grandma but looked like junk to anyone else. I started by going through the drawers, methodically pulling them open and rifling through the contents. There were old letters, receipts, and photos, but nothing that seemed relevant to the Ouija board. I was about to give up when I noticed a small, leather-bound book tucked in the back of one of the drawers. My hands were shaking as I pulled it out, the worn leather soft under my fingers. I opened it to the first page, and my breath caught in my throat. It was Grandma's handwriting, neat and precise, just as I remembered it. The date at the top of the page was from over 30 years ago. As I flipped through the pages, I realised it wasn't just a journal. It was more like a collection of thoughts, notes on things Grandma had been researching, old rituals, superstitions, and most importantly, the Ouija board. I skimmed the entries, my eyes catching on certain words and phrases that sent shivers down my spine. Board passed down through generations, not just a tool, but a gateway. Must be handled with care, never use alone. Spirits trapped, some malevolent, they feed on fear. Basement holds the key. My heart was racing as I read the last few entries. It was clear that Grandma had known the board was dangerous, that it was more than just a harmless game. But what had she meant by the basement holds the key? Was she talking about my basement, or had she hidden something in hers? The next entry was the last, and it was dated just a few days before she passed away. I fear I've let something out. The board. I should never have passed it on. It's too late now. The basement. I must seal it away. But I'm too weak. The words trailed off into a shaky scrawl, as if she'd been too frail to continue. My blood ran cold as I realised what this meant. Whatever was in my basement, it had been released by Grandma, and she hadn't been able to stop it. And now it was after me. I knew then that I couldn't just leave things as they were. I had to go back, confront whatever was in my basement, and finish what Grandma had started. But I also knew I couldn't do it alone. I needed help, someone who understood what I was dealing with, someone who believed. I grabbed the journal, shoved it into my bag, and left Grandma's house as quickly as I could, locking the door behind me. The drive back to my place was a blur, my mind racing with everything I'd just learned. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the first hints of dawn were starting to lighten the sky. I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the house, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. The Ouija board, the basement, the voices, they were all connected, and I had to find a way to stop it before it was too late. With the journal clutched tightly in my hand, I stepped out of the car and headed back into the house. The door closed behind me with a soft click, sealing me inside. I wasn't going to run anymore. It was time to face whatever was waiting for me in the basement. The house was still dark when I stepped inside, the only light coming from the dim glow of the early morning outside. Everything felt unnervingly quiet, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I knew that whatever was down in the basement wouldn't wait much longer. I had to act now. before it grew stronger. I dropped the journal on the kitchen table, flipping it open to the last page, where Grandma's trembling handwriting had warned me of the danger. The words echoed in my mind, mixing with my own fear and determination. I wasn't sure what exactly I was going to do, but I knew I couldn't hesitate any longer. I grabbed a few things from around the house: salt, an old iron fire poker, and the small crucifix that had hung above my bed for as long as I could remember. I wasn't religious, not really, but in that moment, I was willing to try anything. I shoved everything into a small backpack and slung it over my shoulder. I felt a little foolish, like I was gearing up for some amateur ghost hunt, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed every bit of protection I could get. My heart was pounding as I walked to the basement door. I could feel that familiar chill in the air, stronger now, almost palpable, like something was waiting just beyond the threshold. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it seeming to pulse with a life of its own. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on the fire poker, and pushed the door open. The basement steps creaked under my weight as I descended, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The air grew colder with each step, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up, as if I was being watched. When I reached the bottom, the familiar cluttered mess of the basement greeted me, but it was different now. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist on their own, forming strange shapes that vanished when I tried to focus on them. The Ouija board was still lying in the center of the floor, exactly where I had left it, but now the planchette was spinning slowly on its own, the sound of wood scraping against wood echoing through the silent basement. I forced myself to step closer, the fire poker held out in front of me like a sword. My breath was coming in shallow gasps, the cold air burning in my lungs. The planchette suddenly stopped spinning, coming to rest on a single letter, W. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as sandpaper. I could feel the weight of the basement pressing in on me like the walls were closing in. The planchette moved again, quicker this time, spelling out another letter, H, then another. Why? Why? I whispered, my voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. What do you want? For a moment, there was no response. The planchette remained still, and I thought maybe, just maybe, whatever was down here had lost interest in me. But then, it started moving again, faster than before, spelling out a word that made my blood run cold. Come! I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The word hung in the air, vibrating with a malevolent energy. The basement seemed to darken around me, the shadows growing thicker, more substantial. I could feel something moving in the darkness, circling me, getting closer. Desperation clawed at my mind. I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew I couldn't let whatever was down here take me. I remembered the journal, the last shaky entry where Grandma had tried to seal whatever she had released. The basement holds the key, she had written. But what key? What had she meant? I scanned the room frantically, looking for anything that might give me a clue. My flashlight beam caught on the old shelves lining the walls, the dusty boxes, the covered furniture, and then I saw it, a small trapdoor in the far corner of the basement, half hidden behind a stack of boxes. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to pulse with the same dark energy that filled the room. Without thinking, I ran to the trapdoor, shoving the boxes aside with a strength I didn't know I had. The door was old, the wood warped and splintered, but it gave way under my hands. The smell of damp earth wafted up from the darkness below, and I knew that whatever was down there, it was what Grandma had been trying to hide. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to leave the house and never look back. But I couldn't. I had to finish this, for my own sake and for Grandma's. I climbed down into the small space beneath the trapdoor, my flashlight revealing a narrow dirt tunnel that stretched off into the darkness. The air was thick and musty, the walls close enough that I had to hunch over to move forward. I could hear something ahead of me, a faint, rhythmic sound like breathing, but distorted, as if it was coming from something that wasn't quite human. I pressed on, the tunnel winding deeper into the earth. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the darkness pressing in around me, the air growing colder with each step. I knew I was getting close to something. Something that had been buried here for a long time. The tunnel finally opened up into a small, circular chamber. In the centre of the chamber was a stone altar, rough and ancient, covered in strange, unreadable symbols. And lying on the altar was something that made my stomach twist in horror. It was the Ouija board, or at least something like it. The wood was dark, almost black, and the letters were carved deep into the surface, filled with a substance that looked like dried blood. The planchette was already resting on the board, but this one was made of metal, tarnished and corroded with age. The rhythmic breathing filled the chamber, coming from all around me, echoing off the walls. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness, waiting for me to make a move. I knew what I had to do. Whatever was in that board, whatever had been released, it had to be sealed away again. I reached into my bag and pulled out the salt, sprinkling it in a circle around the altar, just like I'd read about in Grandma's journal. The air seemed to hiss and crackle as the salt hit the ground, and the darkness recoiled, shrinking back toward the edges of the chamber. I didn't stop there. I took out the crucifix and placed it on the board, the metal planchette shuddering as if in pain. The rhythmic breathing grew louder, more frantic, the shadows on the walls twisting violently. I could feel something fighting back, trying to break free, but I didn't let up. I started chanting, not really knowing what I was saying, but letting the words flow from deep within me, like they'd been waiting to be spoken. The chamber filled with a deafening roar, the darkness swirling around me like a storm. But I kept going. The altar began to shake, the symbols on the stone glowing with a sickly light. The planchette lifted off the board, spinning wildly in the air before crashing to the ground with a heavy thud. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The chamber fell silent, the air still and lifeless. The darkness had receded, leaving only the faint glow of the symbols on the altar. I stood there, breathing heavily, the fire poker still clutched in my hand, but I could feel that whatever had been here was gone, sealed away once more. I didn't waste any time. I left the chamber, scrambling back through the tunnel and up into the basement. The trapdoor slammed shut behind me, the weight of it heavy with finality. I pushed the boxes back into place, hiding it from view, and made my way back upstairs. The house felt different now, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. The chill in the air was gone, replaced by a warm, comforting stillness. I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted but relieved. It was over. I don't know what exactly had been released that night, or how long it had been trapped in that board, but I do know that it was gone now, sealed away where it couldn't hurt anyone else. Grandma had been right to warn me. The Ouija board wasn't just a game, and the basement wasn't just a place to store old junk. It had been a battleground, a place where something dark had tried to break through, but it hadn't won. Not this time. As I sat there, letting the quiet of the morning wash over me, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. Whatever had happened, it had brought me closer to understanding my grandma and the secrets she had kept hidden for so long. But one thing was certain. I would never look at a Ouija board the same way again. I called my dead friend with the Ouija board. I don't know what possessed me to go through with it. Maybe it was the combination of too much boredom and one too many beers on a cold Friday night. Or maybe, deep down, I just wanted to feel something, anything, after months of numbness. Either way, I ended up agreeing to do something I never thought I'd do. Contact my dead friend, Jason, through a Ouija board. Jason had been my best friend since elementary school. We grew up in the same small town, shared the same group of friends, and did everything together. If you saw one of us, the other wasn't far behind. He was always the life of the party, the guy everyone gravitated towards. But last year, everything changed. Jason died in a car accident on a rainy night in November. He had been driving home after hanging out at our usual spot, the old diner off Route 17. The roads were slick, and he lost control of his car on a sharp turn. The vehicle skidded off the road, hit a tree, and that was it. Jason was gone in an instant. His death hit me hard. I didn't know how to process it. The funeral was a blur, and the days that followed felt like I was walking through a fog. Everyone tried to comfort me, but nothing helped. I started withdrawing from people, skipping classes, and avoiding places that reminded me of him. My friends noticed, of course, but what could they say? We were all grieving in our own way. So when my buddy Mike suggested we use a Ouija board to try and talk to Jason, I was skeptical at first. We were sitting in my dimly lit basement, surrounded by half-empty beer cans and the smell of stale pizza. The idea seemed ridiculous, like something out of a bad horror movie, but Mike had that look in his eyes, the one that meant he was serious. "Come on, man," Mike said, leaning forward on the couch. "You're always talking about how you feel like he's still around, like he's watching over you or something. Why not give it a shot? What's the worst that could happen?" "The worst?" I scoffed, trying to hide my unease. "I don't know. Maybe we end up pissing off some spirit and it haunts us for the rest of our lives." "Don't be such a wuss," Mike laughed, but there was an edge to his voice. He was daring me, and I knew it. If you're too scared, we don't have to do it. But I think it could be therapeutic. Therapeutic. That word made me pause. Maybe, just maybe, talking to Jason, even if it was through some stupid board game, could help me find some closure. I hadn't been able to move on, and the thought of hearing from him, even in some small way, was tempting, so I agreed. We set up the Ouija board on the coffee table, clearing away the mess of junk food and beer cans. The board was old, one of those wooden ones you'd find in your grandma's attic, with faded letters and a smooth, well-worn surface. The planchette, a small heart-shaped piece of wood with a clear window in the centre, sat in the middle, ready to guide us to whatever answers we sought. Mike lit a few candles he found in a drawer, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls. The basement, once our hangout spot, suddenly felt cold and unfamiliar. The silence between us was thick, the kind that made you hyper-aware of every creak and groan in the house. "All right, let's do this," Mike said, his voice lower now, as if he didn't want to disturb whatever might be listening. He placed his fingers on the planchette and looked at me expectantly. I hesitated for a moment before doing the same. The wood was cool under my fingertips, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was too late to back out now. Taking a deep breath, I nodded at Mike, and he began to speak. "Is anyone there?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. At first, nothing happened. We sat there in silence, waiting. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator upstairs, the occasional drip from a leaky pipe, but nothing from the board. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move. I thought Mike was messing with me, trying to get a rise out of me, but when I looked at him, his eyes were wide, his face pale. He wasn't doing this. Something else was. The planchette slid across the board, stopping on the word yes. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt sweat forming on my brow. This wasn't a joke anymore. Something was here with us. "Who are you?" Mike asked, his voice trembling slightly now. The planchette moved again, this time faster, spelling out a single word, Jason. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My hand trembled, and I had to fight the urge to pull away. This was impossible. Jason was dead, but here he was, or something pretending to be him, communicating with us. "Jason," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "Is it really you?" The planchette moved to yes again, and I felt a lump in my throat. I didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. This wasn't how I imagined talking to him would go. There was no comfort in this, only a growing sense of dread. "Are you okay?" I asked, not sure what else to say. For a moment, the planchette stayed still, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side was considering the question. Then it began to move again, slowly, deliberately. "No." I felt a chill run down my spine. Mike glanced at me, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't know what to do any more than I did. "Why not?" Mike asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The planchette started to move again, spelling out something that made my blood run cold. HELPME. The room suddenly felt too small, too dark, and the flickering candlelight seemed more menacing than comforting. I wanted to stop, to leave the board, and never think about this again. But I couldn't. Jason was asking for help. How could I turn away? "What do you need?" I asked, my voice shaking. The planchette moved once more, and the answer it spelled out made my heart nearly stop. FINDME. Mike and I stared at each other, speechless. The implications of what we had just done were sinking in. Jason wanted us to find him. But how? He was dead. There was no body to find. No missing person to track down. And yet, here he was, reaching out from beyond the grave, asking for something that seemed impossible. Before we could ask any more questions, the candles flickered violently, and the planchette flew off the board, clattering to the floor. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath in the air. "Dude, we need to stop," Mike said, his voice panicked. He was already on his feet, backing away from the table. "This is too much. We shouldn't have messed with this." But I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the Ouija board, my mind racing. Jason was out there, somewhere, and he needed our help. How could I ignore that? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized the truth. I didn't know if this was really Jason or something much darker pretending to be him, and that terrified me more than anything else. I don't know what we unleashed that night, but one thing was certain. We couldn't take it back. And as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I knew this was only the beginning. I didn't sleep much after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the Ouija board, the letters glowing faintly in the darkness, and the word help burned into my mind. Jason's voice, if it was really him, haunted me, echoing in the silence of my room. I kept thinking about what he'd said, or rather, what the board had spelled out. Find me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I needed to do, something unfinished. But what? Jason was dead. His body had been found, buried, mourned. There was nothing left to find. Was there? The next morning, I felt like a zombie. My head was pounding, and my thoughts were jumbled, racing between the absurdity of what we'd done and the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. I could barely focus on anything, and every noise made me jump. It was like the world had shifted, just slightly, but enough that I could feel it deep in my bones. Mike texted me around noon, asking how I was doing. I could tell from his messages that he was freaked out too, but he was trying to play it cool. He mentioned that he had some weird dreams, but he didn't go into detail, and I didn't ask. I had enough on my mind without adding his nightmares to the mix. As the day dragged on, I kept thinking about the Ouija board, about what had happened. I knew I needed to talk to someone about it, but I wasn't sure who. Most of our friends would just laugh it off, call it a bad trip or a joke gone too far. But there was one person who might understand. Someone who had known Jason almost as well as I did, his sister, Emily. Emily was a couple of years younger than us, but she and Jason had been close. After he died, she seemed to disappear for a while, retreating into her own world of grief. I hadn't talked to her much since the funeral, but if anyone could make sense of this, it would be her. I hesitated before dialing her number. It had been months since we last spoke, and I wasn't sure how she'd react to hearing from me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to do this. I needed answers. She picked up on the third ring. "Hello?" Her voice was soft, hesitant, like she wasn't sure who'd be calling her. "Hey, Emily. It's me, Tom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, long enough that I started to worry she might hang up. But then she sighed, a deep, weary sound. "Tom, it's been a while." "Yeah, I know. I'm sorry about that. I didn't know what to say after everything." "It's okay," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. I wanted to talk to you about something. Something weird happened last night. and I think it might have to do with Jason. Another pause, this one shorter. I could hear the tension in her voice when she finally spoke. What do you mean? It's kind of hard to explain over the phone. Can I come over? It's probably better if we talk in person. She hesitated, but finally agreed. Okay, I'll be here. Just come by around 6. The rest of the day was a blur. I kept replaying the conversation with Emily in my head, wondering if I was making a mistake by dragging her into this, but I couldn't back out now. Something was pushing me forward, a feeling I couldn't ignore. When I arrived at Emily's house, the sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. Her house looked the same as it always had, but there was something different about it, a heaviness in the air that made my skin prickle. Emily greeted me at the door, looking tired and thinner than I remembered. Her eyes were dark, with shadows underneath, that suggested she hadn't been sleeping much either. She didn't say anything as she let me in, just motioned for me to follow her to the living room. We sat down on the couch, the silence between us thick and awkward. I didn't know where to start, so I just blurted it out. Last night, Mike and I used a Ouija board to try and talk to Jason. Her expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or something close to it. She didn't interrupt, so I kept going, telling her everything that had happened, from the moment we placed our fingers on the planchette to the chilling message we received. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on a spot on the floor. I was about to say something when she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been having dreams," she said, her eyes still distant. "Ever since Jason died. They're always the same. I'm standing on the side of the road, the one where his accident happened. It's dark, and I can hear the rain, but I can't see anything. And then I hear him, Jason. He's calling my name, but I can't find him. No matter how hard I look, he's just gone." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "What would I say?" She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and desperation. "That my dead brother is trying to reach me through my dreams. That I'm going crazy. Everyone would just tell me to move on, to let it go. But I can't, Tom. I can't let it go." "I don't think you're crazy," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Maybe there's something we missed, something he wants us to find." She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know what to do, Tom. I've tried everything to forget, to move on, but it's like he's still here, haunting me." I didn't know what to say. The thought that Jason might be trapped, unable to move on, was terrifying. But even more terrifying was the idea that we were the ones who might have to set him free. "Maybe the dreams are connected to what happened last night," I suggested, though the words felt hollow. "Maybe he's trying to tell us something." Emily wiped her eyes and nodded slowly. "But what? What does he want us to do?" "I don't know," I admitted, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "But I think we need to find out. We owe him that much." She didn't argue, just stared at me with those tired, haunted eyes. "Okay," she said finally, "but where do we even start?" I didn't have an answer for her. All I knew was that we were in over our heads, and whatever we were dealing with was far beyond our understanding. But we had to try. For Jason's sake, we had to try. As I left Emily's house that evening, the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. The shadows seemed darker, more oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The street, usually so familiar and safe, felt foreign and menacing. It was like something had shifted, a line had been crossed, and there was no going back. I didn't know what we were getting ourselves into, but I had a feeling that this was just the beginning of something much worse. Something that wouldn't let us go until it got what it wanted. And deep down, I was terrified that what it wanted was far more than we could ever give. I spent the night after talking to Emily tossing and turning, haunted by thoughts I couldn't silence. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts, and every time I woke up, I felt like something was wrong. Like there was something lurking in the shadows of my room, just out of sight. My mind kept going back to that night with the Ouija board, to the message Jason had sent us. Find me. By the time morning rolled around, I was running on fumes, but there was no way I was going to just let this go. I needed to understand what Jason was trying to tell us. If he was reaching out from wherever he was, he had to have a reason. There had to be something we were missing. I got up early, grabbed a coffee, and headed over to Mike's place. He didn't answer when I knocked, so I let myself in. His door was never locked, which used to bug me, but today I was grateful. The place was a mess, as usual, but I didn't care. I just wanted to talk to him, to figure out our next move. I found Mike still in bed, buried under a mountain of blankets. He looked like he hadn't slept much either. When I shook him awake, he groaned, blinking up at me with bloodshot eyes. "Tom, what time is it?" he mumbled, rubbing his face. "Time to get up," I said, pulling the blankets off him. "We need to talk." He sat up, squinting at the light streaming in through the window. "About what? Is this about last night? Because I've been trying not to think about that." "Yeah, well, I've been thinking about it non-stop," I replied, pacing the room. "And I think we need to do something. We can't just ignore this, Mike. Jason asked for our help." Mike sighed and ran a hand through his messy hair. "I get that, man, but what are we supposed to do? It's not like we're ghost hunters or anything. We're just two guys who messed around with something we shouldn't have." "I talked to Emily yesterday," I said, stopping in my tracks. Mike's expression changed, his eyes narrowing. "You told her about the Ouija board?" "Yeah, and she told me she's been having these weird dreams ever since Jason died. Dreams about the accident, about him calling out to her." Mike frowned, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Shit, that's creepy. Tell me about it," I muttered. "But here's the thing. What if those dreams mean something? What if Jason's trying to show us something?" "Like what?" Mike asked, looking up at me. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think we need to start by going to the place where he died. Maybe there's something there that we missed, something that can help us understand what he wants." Mike stared at me for a long moment, then finally nodded. "All right, I'll go with you. But if we don't find anything, we drop this, okay? We go back to our normal lives and leave this Ouija board crap behind." "Deal," I said, relieved that he was on board. We both knew this was a long shot, but it was the only lead we had. We drove out to the spot where Jason's accident had happened, a stretch of road on the outskirts of town. It was a lonely, desolate place, surrounded by thick woods on either side. The road was narrow and winding, with barely enough room for two cars to pass each other. Even in daylight, it had an eerie, foreboding feel to it. As we pulled up to the side of the road, I felt a chill run through me. The last time I'd been here was the night of the accident, when we all gathered to leave flowers and candles in memory of Jason. The roadside shrine was still there, though most of the flowers had long since wilted and the candles had melted down to stubs. The whole area felt heavy with loss, like the air itself was mourning. We got out of the car and walked over to the spot where Jason's car had gone off the road. The tyre marks were still visible, etched into the asphalt, leading to a broken section of guardrail. Beyond that, the land sloped down sharply into the woods below, where his car had come to a rest, crushed against a tree. "Man, I hate this place," Mike muttered, kicking at the dirt. "Me too," I agreed, looking around. "But there's got to be something here, right? Something we didn't see before." We split up and started searching the area, looking for anything that might stand out. But there wasn't much to see, just the broken guardrail, the tyre marks, and the shrine. I crouched down next to the guardrail, my fingers brushing against the rough wood of the crosses someone had hammered into the ground. Jason's name was carved into one, the letters worn but still legible. I traced them with my finger, feeling a pang of grief that hadn't dulled with time. Then something caught my eye. A small black object was wedged in the dirt, partially hidden under a clump of weeds. I reached down and pulled it free, brushing off the dirt. It was a cell phone, an older model, scratched up and dead. My heart skipped a beat as I turned it over in my hands. "Mike, come here," I called out, my voice shaky. He came over and frowned when he saw what I was holding. "Is that—" "It's Jason's," I said, recognizing the case. It had a sticker on the back, a band logo that he'd always had on his phone. I felt a jolt of unease. But how did it get here? They found his phone in the wreckage, didn't they? Mike nodded, his expression mirroring my confusion. Yeah, they did, but maybe this is a backup or something? Or maybe... He trailed off, and I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. Maybe this phone had been here all along, missed by everyone else. But that didn't make sense. How could they have missed it? I tried to turn it on, but the screen remained dark. The battery was completely dead. We needed to charge it to see if there was anything on it. Messages, photos, something that could give us a clue. But just holding it in my hand made my skin crawl. It felt wrong. Like this phone shouldn't exist. We need to get this charged, I said, pocketing the phone. There's got to be something on it. Mike nodded, but he didn't look convinced. Let's just get out of here, man. This place is giving me the creeps. We got back in the car and drove in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't stop thinking about that phone, about what might be on it. My mind raced with possibilities, some that made sense, and others that sent a chill down my spine. When we got back to Mike's place, we plugged the phone into a charger and waited. It took a while for it to power up, but when it did, the screen flickered to life, showing the familiar lock screen with a picture of Jason and Emily from a few years ago. I hesitated before entering the passcode, feeling like I was about to invade Jason's privacy, but we had come this far. I needed to know. The phone unlocked and the home screen appeared, looking just as it had the last time Jason used it. I felt a strange sense of déjà vu as I scrolled through the apps and messages. Everything seemed normal until I checked his recent texts. There was one message, dated the night of the accident, sent just minutes before he crashed. My heart pounded as I opened it, my eyes scanning the screen. But the message wasn't what I expected. It was from a number I didn't recognize, a series of random digits that didn't look like any phone number I'd ever seen. The text itself was short, just a single line. You weren't supposed to be there. I stared at the message, my mind racing. What did that mean? Who sent it? And why had Jason received it just before he died? But before I could make sense of it, the phone buzzed in my hand and a new message appeared on the screen. You're getting too close. I dropped the phone like it had burned me, my heart pounding in my chest. Mike stared at me, his face pale. What the hell, Tom? He whispered, his voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that something wasn't right. Something far beyond what we could understand. And whatever it was watching us. We were in over our heads, and I had the sinking feeling that we were in more danger than we could ever have imagined. After that message appeared on Jason's phone, I knew we had crossed a line. Whatever we had gotten ourselves into was far darker and more dangerous than we could have imagined. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to stop, to walk away and never look back. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me deeper. A morbid curiosity mixed with a sense of obligation. To Jason, to Emily, and to the promise I made to myself that I wouldn't let this go. Mike was visibly shaken. He kept pacing around the room, rubbing the back of his neck, muttering to himself. I could tell he was on the edge, and honestly, so was I. But we couldn't ignore what was happening. Not anymore. We need to find out who sent that message, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There has to be a way to trace it. Figure out where it came from. Mike stopped pacing and looked at me like I had lost my mind. Are you serious, Tom? Did you see that message? You're getting too close. That's a threat, man. We need to stop. We're messing with something we don't understand. I know, I admitted, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me. But we're in this now. We can't just walk away. What if Jason really needs our help? What if he's stuck, and we're the only ones who can do something about it? Mike shook his head. Frustration and fear etched on his face. And what if we end up like him? What if whatever's behind this decides we're next? I didn't have an answer for that. The truth was, I was scared. More scared than I'd ever been in my life. But I also knew that I couldn't live with myself if I didn't see this through. I grabbed Jason's phone and sat down at the table, staring at the screen. The message was still there, mocking me with its cryptic warning. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe the number could be traced. Maybe there was some clue hidden in Jason's phone that we hadn't seen yet. Mike sat down across from me, his expression grim. Fine. If you're going to keep digging, then I'm in. But we do this carefully, all right? No more jumping into things without thinking. I nodded, grateful that he wasn't abandoning me. Agreed, we'll be smart about it. We spent the next few hours scouring the phone for any additional clues. Most of it was mundane, old texts, photos, apps. But as we dug deeper, we found something strange. There was a folder hidden deep within the phone's storage, labelled with a string of random numbers and letters. It wasn't something that Jason would have created on his own. It felt out of place. I opened the folder, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside were several files, all with cryptic names. Most of them were unreadable, just a mess of characters that made no sense. But one file stood out. It was an audio recording, dated the night of Jason's accident. Mike and I exchanged a nervous glance before I hit play. At first, there was nothing, just the crackling sound of static. But then, faintly, we heard Jason's voice. He sounded panicked, his breathing heavy and erratic. "They're following me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know who they are, but they've been watching me for weeks. I tried to lose them, but they're always there, just out of sight. I don't know what they want, but I'm scared, man. I'm really scared." There was a pause, and we could hear the sound of tires screeching, the wind whipping through the car as he sped up. Jason's voice came back, more frantic this time. "I don't think I'm going to make it. If you find this, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The recording cut off abruptly, leaving us in stunned silence. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the blood draining from my face. Jason had known something was coming for him, something that had been watching him, following him, and now it was after us. Mike was the first to speak, his voice hoarse. "What the hell does that mean? Who was following him?" "I don't know," I said, my mind racing. "But whatever it is, it's not done. It's still out there." We were both silent for a moment, the weight of what we'd just heard sinking in. Jason had been terrified, and now that terror was spilling over into our lives. It wasn't just a ghost or a spirit. This was something real, something dangerous. "We need to go to the crash site again," I said, my voice trembling. "There's something there we missed, something that can explain all of this." Mike looked at me like I was insane, but he didn't argue. I think he knew, deep down, that we couldn't stop now. Whatever was going on, we had to see it through. We drove back to the crash site, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road as we pulled up to the spot where Jason had gone off the road. The shrine was still there, a lonely reminder of what had happened. But this time, as we got out of the car, I noticed something different. There was a faint trail leading into the woods, barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't there before, or maybe we just hadn't seen it. But now it stood out like a beacon, beckoning us to follow it. Without a word, we started down the trail, our footsteps crunching on the dead leaves and twigs. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the air became, like the forest itself was closing in on us. After what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, we came to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old, dilapidated shack, its roof sagging and the wood rotting away. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. But there was something about it, something that made my skin crawl. Mike hesitated at the edge of the clearing, his face pale. "I don't like this, Tom. We should go back." But I couldn't turn back now. There was something inside that shack, something that Jason had wanted us to find. I could feel it, a pull that I couldn't resist. "I have to see," I said, more to myself than to Mike. He cursed under his breath, but followed me as I approached the shack. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, the smell of mildew and rot filling my nose. The inside was as run down as the outside. Broken furniture, shattered windows, the floor covered in debris. But in the center of the room was something that didn't belong. A large circular symbol had been carved into the floor, its edges precise and clean, like it had been made recently. It was surrounded by strange markings, symbols that I didn't recognize. In the center of the circle was a small black book, its cover worn but the pages intact. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The air in the room felt electric, like it was humming with some unseen energy. I reached down and picked up the book, the leather cold and smooth against my skin. As I opened it, a gust of wind blew through the shack, sending shivers down my spine. The pages were filled with more symbols, diagrams, and writing in a language I couldn't understand. But one thing was clear, this was no ordinary book. It was old, ancient even, and it radiated a sense of power that made me uneasy. "What the hell is that?" Mike asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted, flipping through the pages. "But I think this is what Jason was trying to find. Or maybe what he was trying to escape." As I stood there, the book in my hands, I felt a cold breeze brush against the back of my neck. I turned, but there was nothing there, just the empty room, the fading light filtering through the broken windows. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A shadow, long and thin, darted across the wall, so fast I almost missed it. But it was there, just for a moment, before it disappeared into the darkness. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mike nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here, Tom. Now!" But as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The wood splintering as it sealed itself tight. The wind picked up, swirling around us, carrying with it a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was deep, distorted, and it echoed through the room, reverberating in my chest. I felt a surge of panic, my heart racing as I realized we were trapped. The shadows on the walls began to shift, twisting and writhing like living things, their forms growing darker and more defined. They slithered across the floor, inching closer to us, their movements deliberate and menacing. I clutched the book to my chest, my mind racing as I searched for a way out. But there was none. We were surrounded, the walls closing in as the shadows reached for us. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The wind died down, the shadows receded, and the door creaked open, the way out clear. But the voice, that awful voice, lingered in the air, its final words sending a chill down my spine. "This is only the beginning." Mike and I bolted from the shack, our feet pounding against the ground as we raced back through the woods. Neither of us spoke, too terrified to process what had just happened. When we finally reached the car, we jumped in and sped away, leaving the crash site and that cursed shack far behind. But I knew, deep down, that we hadn't escaped. Whatever we had unleashed was still with us, following us, watching us, and it wasn't going to let us go that easily. After the terror at the shack, I couldn't think straight. My mind was a tangled mess of fear and confusion, replaying the events over and over, searching for some kind of explanation. But there was none. The book, the shadows, the voice, none of it made sense, and yet it was all terrifyingly real. Mike and I drove in silence, the tension between us thick as we tried to comprehend what had just happened. The further we got from the crash site, the more I expected the fear to fade, for the adrenaline to wear off and leave me feeling exhausted and stupid for getting caught up in all of this. But that never happened. Instead, the fear settled into a cold, gnawing dread, something that clung to my bones and wouldn't let go. We didn't speak much after we got back to Mike's place. He disappeared into his room without a word, and I could hear him pacing, muttering to himself, trying to make sense of it all. I wanted to do the same, curl up somewhere dark and quiet and pretend none of this had ever happened. But the book was still in my hands, its presence a constant, oppressive weight that demanded my attention. I sat down at the kitchen table, the book before me, and tried to gather my thoughts. Whatever this thing was, it was connected to Jason, to his death, and to the message we'd received through the Ouija board. But how? And why? I flipped through the pages again, my fingers trembling. The symbols, the strange diagrams, the writing in that unfamiliar language, it all seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if the book itself was alive. I could feel it. A subtle vibration under my fingertips, a hum that grew louder the more I focused on it. And then, buried in the middle of the book, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a photograph, old and yellowed, tucked between the pages like a forgotten bookmark. I pulled it out carefully, holding it up to the light. The photo was of a group of people, standing in front of what looked like the same shack we had just fled from. Their faces were stern, their clothes old-fashioned, and in their hands they held objects that looked disturbingly familiar. Candles, symbols, and in the centre, a book identical to the one I held in my hands. But it wasn't the eerie familiarity of the scene that made my heart skip a beat. It was the face of the man standing in the middle of the group, a man who looked exactly like Jason. I stared at the photo, my mind reeling. It couldn't be him. This photo had to be at least 100 years old, but the resemblance was uncanny. The same eyes, the same sharp features, even the same serious expression I'd seen on Jason's face when he was deep in thought. It was like staring into a mirror that reflected a different time. I placed the photo on the table, my hands shaking. The implications of what I was seeing were too much to process. Jason, if this was Jason, had somehow been connected to this cult or whatever it was. And now, a century later, that connection had reached out to claim him. And by extension, us. I needed answers, but the book wasn't giving me any. It was only raising more questions, each one darker and more terrifying than the last. I didn't know what to do, who to turn to. Mike was no help. He was just as lost and scared as I was. But there was one person who might be able to shed some light on this, someone who had been closer to Jason than anyone. Emily. I grabbed the book and the photo, shoving them into my backpack, and headed for the door. Mike didn't even look up as I left. He was too deep in his own spiraling thoughts. I didn't blame him. Part of me wished I could just walk away too, pretend this was all a bad dream. But I couldn't. Jason wouldn't let me. The drive to Emily's house was a blur, my thoughts racing faster than the car. When I finally pulled up in front of her house, I was surprised to see that all the lights were off. It was only just getting dark, but the place looked deserted, almost abandoned. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, the sound echoing in the stillness of the evening. "Emily?" I called out, my voice cracking with anxiety. "It's Tom. We need to talk." Still no answer. I tried the doorknob, and to my surprise, it turned easily in my hand. The door swung open with a low creak, revealing the dim interior of the house. I hesitated on the threshold, every instinct telling me to turn around and leave. But something compelled me to step inside. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I called out for Emily again, but there was no response. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor as I made my way through the darkened rooms, my eyes searching for any sign of her. When I reached the living room, I froze. Emily was sitting on the couch, her back to me, staring straight ahead at the blank TV screen. Her posture was rigid, unnatural, like she was a mannequin propped up in the middle of the room. A sense of dread washed over me as I approached her, my heart hammering in my chest. "Emily?" I whispered, reaching out to touch her shoulder. The moment my fingers brushed her skin, she turned her head sharply, her eyes locking onto mine. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. There was something wrong with her eyes, something dark and empty, like she wasn't really there. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "Emily, what's going on?" I asked, panic rising in my throat. "What happened to you?" But she didn't answer. Instead, she stood up slowly, her movements jerky, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. She took a step toward me, her eyes still fixed on mine. "They're here," she whispered, her voice echoing in the silent room. "They're always here, waiting." A chill ran down my spine as I backed away, the darkness in the room seeming to grow thicker, more oppressive. I glanced around, half expecting to see the shadows from the shack, the ones that had nearly taken us, creeping into the room. But there was nothing. Just the overwhelming sense that something was horribly, irreversibly wrong. I needed to get out, to get Emily out. Whatever had taken hold of her, whatever had been stalking us since that night with the Ouija board, it was here now, in this house, and it wasn't going to let us go. "Emily, we have to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "Please, come with me." She shook her head, a sad smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "It's too late, Tom. They've already found us." As she spoke, the lights in the house flickered, then went out completely, plunging us into darkness. I could hear her breathing, shallow and fast, but I couldn't see her anymore. The shadows had swallowed her up, leaving me alone in the pitch-black room. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard it. The same low, guttural whisper that had haunted me since the shack. It was closer now, almost as if it was right next to me, breathing down my neck. "You were warned." The words sent a wave of terror through me, freezing me in place. I could feel the darkness closing in, pressing down on me, suffocating me. But I couldn't leave Emily. I couldn't leave her to face whatever this was alone. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I reached out into the darkness, my fingers searching for her. I felt something cold and clammy, a hand, but before I could grasp it, it was yanked away, pulled back into the void. "No!" I shouted, stumbling forward, but it was too late. The shadows surged around me, and I felt a force like icy fingers gripping my arms, dragging me back. The last thing I heard before everything went black was Emily's voice, soft and distant, like a fading echo. "Find me." When I woke up, I was lying on the cold, hard floor of my apartment. The book was gone, the photograph gone, and my head was pounding like I'd been hit with a sledgehammer. I had no memory of how I got there, no idea what had happened after the darkness took me. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and looked around. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. My phone, which had been charging on the kitchen counter, was now sitting on the floor in the middle of the room, its screen cracked and flickering. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and saw that there was one new message. It was from Jason's number. "It's not over." I stared at the screen, my mind numb with fear and disbelief. Whatever this was, whatever had taken Jason, whatever had taken Emily, it wasn't finished with me yet. And I knew, deep down, that I was next.